Elliot James, a 17-year-old with a mop of unruly dark hair and a heart full of dreams, stood outside the pharmacy, shoving his hands deep into the pockets of his worn jacket. It was a crisp autumn evening, the kind where the air held a faint chill, making his breath visible as he exhaled. A breeze rustled the orange and yellow leaves scattered across the pavement, and Elliot glanced up at the glowing sign above the pharmacy door. His thoughts wandered as he clutched a crumpled piece of paper listing his mom's prescription details. Life hadn't been easy for Elliot or his family lately, but he always found a way to manage, even if it meant stretching every dollar until it squeaked. The small pharmacy was quiet when he stepped inside, the chime above the door ringing softly as he entered. The warm, bright lights offered a welcome contrast to the grayness of the day, and the faint scent of antiseptic hung in the air. Elliot scanned the store quickly. There were only a few other customers, most browsing the shelves of over-the-counter medicines and snacks. He spotted the counter at the far end and walked over, his sneakers squeaking faintly against the polished floor. "Hi, I'm here to pick up a prescription for James," he said, handing the paper to the pharmacist, a kindly middle-aged woman with glasses perched low on her nose. She took the slip with a nod and began typing something into her computer. As he waited, Elliot noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. An elderly woman in a lavender cardigan had shuffled up to the counter beside him, her hands clasped tightly around a small handbag. Her hair was neatly combed into soft white waves, and her expression was one of quiet determination as she approached. She looked like someone who had once been full of energy but now moved with the caution of age. "Good evening, Mrs. Clark," the pharmacist said warmly, turning her attention to the woman after retrieving Elliot's bag. "Your prescription is ready." Mrs. Clark nodded with a small, polite smile. "Thank you. How much is it?" The pharmacist glanced at the screen. "It's $45. Mrs. Clark's face fell, and she opened her handbag, her fingers searching through its contents with growing urgency. "Oh dear," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I must have left my wallet at home. I was so sure I brought it with me." Elliot could see the color rising in her cheeks as she continued rummaging through the bag, pulling out tissues, a pair of glasses, and a neatly folded shopping list, but no wallet. "I don't know what I was thinking," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm so sorry." The pharmacist hesitated, her kind expression tinged with concern. "It's all right, Mrs. Clark," she said gently. "You can come back tomorrow. We'll hold this for you." Mrs. Clark nodded slowly, but the disappointment in her eyes was clear. She clutched the counter for support, her shoulders sagging slightly. "I just don't know if I can make another trip this week," she admitted, almost to herself. Elliot, standing a few feet away, felt his heart ache at the sight. He knew that feeling, needing something essential, and realizing you couldn't afford it or didn't have the means to get it. It wasn't just about the money. It was the embarrassment, the helplessness, and the sinking sense of failure. For a brief moment he thought about his own situation. He'd been saving every dollar he could from his part-time job at the diner, trying to scrape together enough for college. The $45 in his pocket wasn't much, but it was what his mom needed for her prescription, and a little extra for a few groceries. But then he looked at Mrs. Clark again, and the decision was made in an instant. "Excuse me," he said, stepping forward. His voice was steady, but his heart pounded in his chest. "I can cover it." Mrs. Clark turned to him, her pale blue eyes wide with surprise. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly let you do that, young man," she said, shaking her head. "That's far too kind of you." "It's really okay," Elliot said, offering her a reassuring smile. "Everyone forgets their wallet sometimes. It happens. Besides, it's not a big deal." Mrs. Clark opened her mouth to protest again, but the words didn't come. Instead, she looked at him, her expression softening. "You're very sweet," she said quietly. "But I don't want to put you out." Elliot pulled out his wallet and placed two $20 bills and a crumpled $5 note on the counter before she could say another word. "It's no trouble," he said, giving her a small nod. The pharmacist, who had been watching the exchange with a kind smile, slid the money into the register and handed Mrs. Clark a small white paper bag with her prescription. "Here you go, Mrs. Clark," she said. "You're all set." Mrs. Clark took the bag with trembling hands, holding it close to her chest. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. She turned back to Elliot, her eyes shining. "Thank you so much, young man. I don't know how to repay you." Elliot waved off her gratitude with a shrug. "You don't have to. Just take care of yourself, okay?" But Mrs. Clark wasn't content to leave it at that. She reached into her handbag again, this time pulling out a small notepad and a pen. "At least let me give you my number," she said, scribbling something down. "Please call me when you get home. I insist. I'd like to repay you for your kindness." Elliot hesitated for a moment before taking the piece of paper. The faint scent of lavender clung to it, and the handwriting was neat and careful, the kind you didn't see much anymore. "You really don't have to," he said, though he smiled. "It was nothing." Mrs. Clark shook her head firmly. "It wasn't nothing to me," she said. Her voice was steady now, her gratitude unmistakable. As Elliot left the pharmacy, the cool evening air hit him, and he slipped the note carefully into his jacket pocket. His wallet was considerably lighter, and he'd have to figure out how to stretch his remaining funds even further, but he couldn't bring himself to regret it. The relief and gratitude on Mrs. Clark's face had been worth every penny. He walked home with a lighter step, the sound of leaves crunching underfoot. The note in his pocket felt like a small weight, a promise of a conversation yet to come. He decided he'd call her as soon as he got home. Little did he know that one act of kindness would set into motion a series of events that would change his life forever. Elliot arrived home to the smell of simmering soup wafting from the kitchen, a comforting aroma that reminded him of simpler times. His mother, who had been unwell for months now, was seated at the kitchen table, folding laundry slowly but methodically. The light overhead flickered slightly, a reminder of the electrical problems they couldn't afford to fix just yet. "How did it go, sweetheart?" she asked, looking up with a tired smile. "Got everything," Elliot replied, placing her prescription on the counter. He didn't mention Mrs. Clark right away, unsure how to explain why he'd spent nearly half his cash on a stranger's medication. Instead, he busied himself with hanging his jacket on the back of a chair, his fingers brushing the note in his pocket. As he washed his hands at the sink, his thoughts returned to Mrs. Clark, her frail hands clutching that small bag of medicine. The look of disbelief on her face when he had stepped in to help. The way her eyes had softened with gratitude. The note felt like it was burning a hole in his pocket. A quiet insistence that he follow through on his promise. After dinner, Elliot finally pulled the note out. The handwriting was neat and precise, a reflection of the woman herself. The number was scrawled beneath her name, Helen Clark. He stared at it for a long moment, his nerves building. Why was he so anxious about calling her? He had done something kind, and she was simply following up. But something about her demeanor, polite yet resolute, had left a mark on him. He dialed the number before he could talk himself out of it. The phone rang twice before a warm, familiar voice answered. "Hello." "Hi, Mrs. Clark? This is Elliot, from the pharmacy," he said, shifting uncomfortably as he leaned against the counter. "You gave me your number earlier." "Elliot," she exclaimed, her voice lighting up with recognition. "I'm so glad you called. I wasn't sure if you would." "Well, I said I would," he replied with a small chuckle. "You didn't have to give me your number, though. It really wasn't a big deal." "It was a big deal to me," she said firmly. "Not many people would have done what you did. And I want to repay you. Could we meet for coffee tomorrow?" "My treat, of course." Elliot hesitated. He wasn't in the habit of meeting strangers for coffee, let alone older women who seemed to live in a world far removed from his own. But something in her tone left no room for argument. It wasn't just about the money. "Sure," he said at last. "I can do that. Where should I meet you?" They agreed on a small cafe in the heart of town, a place Elliot had passed dozens of times but never entered. After hanging up, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at his phone with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. What exactly was he walking into? The next afternoon, he arrived at the cafe early, the crisp autumn air nipping at his face as he pushed open the door. The interior was cozy, with warm wood tones and the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee. A few patrons sat scattered around, reading or chatting softly. Mrs. Clark was already there, seated at a corner table by the window. She waved him over with a smile that transformed her face, making her seem younger, more vibrant. She was dressed neatly in a pale blue sweater and a scarf that matched the soft gray of her hair. "Elliot, thank you for coming," she said as he slid into the seat across from her. "I hope I didn't inconvenience you." "Not at all," he replied, feeling strangely at ease. "It's nice to get out of the house." They ordered their drinks, tea for her, black coffee for him, and for the first few minutes, the conversation was light. She asked him about school, his family, and his plans for the future. He found himself opening up more than he'd expected, telling her about his dream of going to college, his part-time job at the diner, and the financial struggles that made it all seem so out of reach. "You've been through so much," she said softly, her expression thoughtful. "And yet you still found it in your heart to help me yesterday. That says a lot about you, Elliot." He shrugged, feeling a little self-conscious. "I just did what anyone would do." "Not everyone would," she countered, her voice firm. "Kindness like that is rare these days." As the conversation flowed, Elliot learned more about her too. She had lived in the town for most of her life, a retired schoolteacher who had spent decades nurturing young minds. She spoke fondly of her late husband, a kind-hearted man who had shared her love of books and classical music. But when she mentioned her family, her tone grew quieter. Her children were scattered across the country, busy with their own lives, and she rarely heard from them. "I suppose that's just how life goes," she said with a small smile, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "But it makes encounters like ours all the more meaningful." At the end of the meeting, Mrs. Clark reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. "I meant what I said about repaying you," she said, sliding it across the table. Elliot opened it hesitantly, his eyes widening when he saw the cash inside. Not only had she included the $45, but there was an additional $50. This is too much," he stammered. "It's exactly what I want to give you," she said with a smile. "Consider it a small reward for your kindness, and maybe a little something extra for yourself." He tried to argue, but she waved him off. "You can't change my mind, young man. I'm quite stubborn, you know." As he walked home that day, the envelope tucked securely in his jacket pocket, Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that his encounter with Mrs. Clark was more than just a chance meeting. Something about her had left a mark on him, a quiet warmth that lingered long after their conversation. And though he didn't know it yet, this was only the beginning of a friendship that would transform both their lives in ways neither could have imagined. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Elliot had expected. It began with a simple thank you text from Mrs. Clark, a small note of gratitude that warmed him on an otherwise chilly day. From there, their connection deepened. She invited him over for tea at her modest yet cozy home, a charming little house on a quiet street lined with towering maple trees. It wasn't far from his neighborhood, but stepping inside felt like entering a different world. Mrs. Clark's house was a treasure trove of memories. The walls were adorned with framed photographs of smiling faces, her husband, her children, and what Elliot guessed were grandchildren. Bookshelves lined the living room, filled with novels and old textbooks. A grand piano sat in the corner, its surface polished to a mirror shine, though it looked as if it hadn't been played in years. "You play?" Elliot asked, gesturing to the piano during one of his visits. "Not anymore," she replied with a wistful smile. "My husband was the musician. He used to fill this house with music every evening. It feels a bit lonely without it now." Elliot noticed the way her voice softened whenever she spoke of her late husband. She often shared stories about their life together, how they'd met at a dance, the long summer road trips they used to take, and the quiet evenings spent reading by the fire. Despite her warm demeanor, there was an undercurrent of loneliness in Mrs. Clark's life that Elliot couldn't ignore. She rarely mentioned her children, but when she did, it was with the tone of resignation. They were busy, she explained, with families and careers that left little time for visits or phone calls. Elliot, who was no stranger to feeling overlooked, found himself drawn to her stories. He began visiting her regularly, often bringing small tokens of appreciation, a loaf of bread from the bakery near his work, or a paperback novel he thought she might like. In return, she shared her wisdom, her laughter, and sometimes even her homemade apple pie, which quickly became his favorite treat. One day, after their usual tea and conversation, Mrs. Clark surprised Elliot with a question. "Elliot, have you thought much about college?" she asked, her pale blue eyes studying him intently. He paused, the question striking a nerve. "Yeah, I've thought about it a lot," he admitted. "I've always wanted to go. But it's expensive and my family doesn't really have the money. So I'm just trying to save up as much as I can for now." Mrs. Clark nodded thoughtfully, tapping her fingers lightly against her teacup. "What would you study?" "Engineering," he said, his face lighting up. "I've always been good at math and science, and I love figuring out how things work, but it feels like such a long shot right now." She didn't press the issue further, but the thoughtful expression on her face lingered as they talked about other things. It wasn't until a week later that she brought it up again. They were sitting in her living room, a gentle rain pattering against the windows. Mrs. Clark reached for a folder on the coffee table and handed it to Elliot. "What's this?" he asked, opening it cautiously. Inside were pages of notes and documents, neatly organized. At the top was a letter addressed to a university he had once dreamed of attending. His heart raced as he skimmed through it. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You're a bright young man, Elliot, and you've shown me a kindness I'll never forget. I want to help you achieve your dreams. I'd like to pay for your college education." Elliot stared at her, speechless. "Mrs. Clark, I can't let you do that," he finally managed. "That's way too much. I don't even know how to thank you for something like that." She smiled gently, reaching across the table to pat his hand. "You've already thanked me, Elliot. Every time you've come here, every time you've listened to my stories, you've given me something I hadn't realized I was missing, a sense of connection. And I've saved more than enough over the years. My children are well settled. And I'd rather see this money go toward something meaningful." He shook his head, still struggling to wrap his mind around her offer. "But why me?" "Because you're worth it," she said simply. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes as he looked down at the folder in his lap. No one had ever believed in him this way before, not even his teachers, who had often dismissed him as just another quiet kid with potential that would likely go untapped. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know what to say, but thank you." Mrs. Clark smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You've already said enough, Elliot. Now, let's figure out how to make this happen." Over the next few weeks, they worked together to finalize applications and gather the necessary paperwork. Mrs. Clark became more than just a benefactor, she became a mentor, guiding Elliot through the daunting process with patience and encouragement. Elliot's visits to her home became a regular fixture in his life. They celebrated small victories together, like when he received his first acceptance letter, and consoled each other during moments of doubt. For Mrs. Clark, it was as though she had gained a grandson, someone who brought warmth and purpose back into her quiet days. And for Elliot, her belief in him became the foundation upon which he began to build a future he had once thought impossible. Over the months that followed, Elliot became a regular visitor at Mrs. Clark's house. What began as occasional visits turned into a steady routine. Every Saturday afternoon, he would arrive at her door with a loaf of fresh bread from the bakery or a small bouquet of flowers from the market, simple tokens he could afford, though she always insisted they weren't necessary. Mrs. Clark, in turn, welcomed him with open arms, treating him as though he were the grandson she had always wished lived closer. She introduced him to her love of books, pulling out dusty tomes and well-worn novels from her shelves. They spent hours discussing their favorite characters, sharing stories, and even making lists of books Elliot could borrow for the week. One crisp December afternoon, as the first flakes of snow began to drift down from the gray sky, Elliot arrived at Mrs. Clark's house to find her seated at the dining table with papers spread out before her. She greeted him with her usual smile but seemed preoccupied, her brow furrowed slightly as she worked through the pile of documents. "Am I interrupting?" Elliot asked, hanging his coat on the rack by the door. "Not at all," she said, gesturing for him to join her. "I was just going through some old files. It's amazing how much paperwork you accumulate over a lifetime." Elliot sat down across from her, eyeing the stack of neatly organized papers. There were bank statements, letters, and what looked like a stack of old photographs. "Are these family photos?" he asked, reaching for the stack. Mrs. Clark nodded, a wistful smile tugging at her lips. "Yes, some of them. Most of my family lives far away now. We don't see each other often, but I like to keep these around. They remind me of happier times." Elliot flipped through the photos, pausing at one of a younger Mrs. Clark holding hands with a man who exuded quiet strength and kindness. "Is this your husband?" She nodded, her eyes softening. "That's Arthur. He passed away almost 10 years ago. He was the love of my life." Elliot nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He couldn't imagine losing someone so integral to his life. "You must miss him a lot." "Every day," she admitted. "But life goes on, and I've learned to find joy in small things, like visits from kind-hearted young men." Her words brought a smile to Elliot's face, but before he could respond, she reached for another stack of papers. "Speaking of which, I've been meaning to discuss something with you, Elliot." He raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Mrs. Clark took a deep breath, her hand steady as she sorted through the pile. Finally, she pulled out a single sheet of paper and slid it across the table to him. It was a scholarship application. "I've noticed how hard you've been working," she said softly. "You've told me about your dreams of going to college, but you've also mentioned how difficult it's been to save up. I want to help." Elliot's eyes widened as he looked at the form. "You want to help me apply for scholarships?" "More than that," she said, leaning forward slightly. "I've been saving for years, Elliot. Arthur and I didn't have extravagant tastes and we were careful with our money. I don't have any immediate family who needs it, and I can think of no better use for it than to help someone like you achieve their dreams." Elliot's mouth fell open in shock. "Mrs. Clark, I can't accept that. It's too much. You've already done so much for me." "Nonsense," she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You've brought so much joy into my life. You've reminded me that there's still kindness and goodness in the world. And if I have the means to give you a better future, why wouldn't I?" Elliot stared at her, emotions swirling in his chest. Gratitude, disbelief, and a deep sense of humility filled him. "I don't even know what to say," he finally managed. "Say you'll think about it," she said with a smile. "And that you'll let me help you fill out this application." He nodded slowly, still overwhelmed by her generosity. "Okay, I'll think about it." They spent the rest of the afternoon going over the details, Mrs. Clark guiding him with the same patience and care she must have used with her students. By the time he left that evening, the scholarship application was nearly complete, and Elliot felt a spark of hope he hadn't felt in years. As he walked home through the softly falling snow, he couldn't help but marvel at how much his life had changed since the day he paid for Mrs. Clark's prescription. That small act of kindness had opened a door to a friendship that had not only enriched his life but also given him a chance to dream again. And though he still felt hesitant about accepting her offer, deep down, he knew that Mrs. Clark's kindness was a gift he would treasure for the rest of his life. Months passed and winter gave way to spring. The snow melted into streams that sparkled under the warming sun, and the town came alive again with the promise of new beginnings. For Elliot, those months were transformative. With Mrs. Clark's guidance, he applied for scholarships in colleges, navigating the intimidating maze of paperwork and deadlines with her steady encouragement. But more than that, their friendship deepened into something neither of them had anticipated. Elliot often found himself at her house after school, sharing stories from his day or helping her with small tasks around the house. They baked together, laughed together, and even tackled her overgrown garden, which soon became a vibrant patch of flowers and herbs. One sunny afternoon, Mrs. Clark invited him over for what she called a special celebration. When he arrived, he found her on the back patio, a small cake on the table and 2 glasses of lemonade glistening in the sunlight. "What's the occasion?" he asked. His curiosity piqued. "You'll see," she said with a mischievous smile. As they sat down, she handed him a sealed envelope. Inside was an acceptance letter to the university of his dreams. Elliot stared at the letter in disbelief, his hands trembling. "Congratulations," Mrs. Clark said, her voice warm with pride. "You earned it." "I don't know what to say," Elliot stammered, his eyes misting. "I wouldn't have even applied without you." Mrs. Clark shook her head. "You did this, Elliot. All I did was help you see what you were capable of." Overwhelmed, he hugged her, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "You've changed my life, Mrs. Clark." "And you've changed mine," she replied, patting his shoulder. As the summer approached, Elliot prepared for his next chapter with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Mrs. Clark insisted on helping him gather supplies, turning her living room into a staging area filled with notebooks, bedding, and a laptop she had insisted on purchasing despite his protests. The night before he left for college, Elliot visited her one last time. They sat on her porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, handing him a cup of tea. "I think so," he said, though there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "You'll do great," she said firmly. "And remember, I'm just a phone call away. Always." As the stars began to twinkle overhead, Elliot thought back to the day he met her at the pharmacy. That single moment of kindness had led to a friendship that not only changed his circumstances but also his perspective on life. When he left for college the next morning, Mrs. Clark stood on her porch, waving as his mom drove him to the bus station. He promised to visit during every break, and he kept that promise. Years later, Elliot stood in a cap and gown, his diploma in hand, with Mrs. Clark sitting proudly in the audience. As he walked across the stage to cheers and applause, he looked at her and smiled, silently thanking her for everything she had done. That day, as they celebrated together, Mrs. Clark said something that stayed with him forever. "Kindness is like a seed, Elliot. You plant it without expecting much, but sometimes it grows into something bigger than you could ever imagine." And as Elliot began his career, built a life for himself, and even started giving back to his own community, he carried those words in his heart, knowing that one small act of kindness had created a ripple that changed both their lives forever.